This is 8-Minute Climate Fix, a podcast helping you understand the energy and climate challenge in just a few minutes. I'm your host, Paul Schuster. Transitioning away from burning fossil fuels is tough. Entire ecosystems of industry have evolved over time to support our dependence on oil, gas, coal, and unwinding those dependencies takes action at both the individual level as well as at a broader systemic level. Today's episode is about the latter, where I plan to move beyond the individual climate technologies to talk about the challenges that we have in transitioning from a systems level perspective. The hope is to provide some clarity on not only why wholesale change is so hard, but also on what we can do to actually accelerate it. 8 minutes. It's how long it takes the sun's race to hit Earth, or, 30 episodes of this, 2 bottles of wine, and an oven set at 400 degrees, and I'll show you one heck of a burnt turkey. Let's get it on. Most of my episodes on this show deal with very discrete technologies or policies or processes. Today is going to be something a bit different, where I'll talk about some of the challenges that the energy transition faces at a systems level. When thinking about what an individual person or household or company can do, the thought process can be fairly linear. Shift from gas to electricity by installing a heat pump or by purchasing an electric vehicle. Place solar panels on your roof and boost your renewable energy quotient. But at a macro economy-wide level, the decision-making is far different. There are interconnecting systems that need to be unwound at the same time in order for the transition to be as smooth as possible. I'll offer that there are 2 types of systems that policymakers, utilities, and regulators need to consider when navigating this new clean energy economy. The first is perhaps the most intuitive, and that's the ecosystem challenge. Building entirely new industrial ecosystems from scratch is really difficult. And for us to meet our climate goals as a planet, we're essentially creating entirely new industries out of nothing. Take EVs. For consumers to feel comfortable buying electric vehicles, they need to know that the chargers will be available wherever they may drive, which means the electric infrastructure needs to be installed, the charging tariffs worked out. Consumers also need to know that a vibrant used car market will be there on the other side, or that mechanics and auto shops will be available to work on their vehicles. This is an ecosystem, a vast web of interconnected resources that all have to work together in order for the transition to an EV to happen. Intuitively, I think we can all see how much of a challenge this is, and some technologies, and I'll throw EVs into this mix, are actually further along than others in making their ecosystems happen. Others, such as hydrogen or carbon capture or sustainable aviation fuels, these are more nascent industries and have a lot further to go in building out their industries. But, well, I know you didn't come to this show to have me tell you the semi-obvious fact that creating entire industries from scratch is difficult, so here's the insight I'd like for you to take away from this episode. Ecosystems aren't the only systems level issue facing the energy transition. We also have dependent systems that need to be addressed as well. What are these? Where ecosystems surround and support new clean technologies, dependent systems are the existing interconnections that need to be unraveled carefully or the entire construct falls apart. Think of ecosystems as the building blocks with which to build a tower, and dependent systems as the Jenga tower you're trying not to have fall apart. One example of this is the challenge that aviation companies have in transitioning to cleaner fuels. But to illustrate that, let's talk about our EVs again. Say we're myopic and just looking at auto transport as our decarbonization effort of the day. Maybe we've done a marginal abatement assessment curve and we've prioritized out on an economy basis that decarbonizing auto transport is the best way to economically drive down GHG emissions. Great. We invest behind incentives to build out the ecosystem. We install a whole bunch of fast chargers along our highways. We put tax incentives in place to encourage customers to buy EVs. And let's say we're wildly successful in this effort. That means that the demand for gasoline goes down, which has ramifications at the refinery where that gas was being produced. For each barrel of oil that comes into a refinery, the facility will typically use about 20% of that for gasoline, maybe about 30% for diesel, and about 10% for jet fuel. See, I brought this back around. If that refinery is seeing a massive decrease in demand for gas or diesel, it fundamentally changes the economics of the facility. And because jet fuel is a secondary source of revenue, it's not as though the refinery can simply make more or charge more in order to make up the difference. And if the refinery decides that the economics overall don't justify staying in business, now the shift to automobile electric vehicles is fundamentally affecting whether the aviation industry can get their jet fuel at all. This is why, from a systems level lens, so much emphasis has been put on transitioning everything all at once. I sometimes get asked where the biggest bang for the buck is in climate action, but there may not be a right answer. Everything is so interconnected and dependent upon each other that policymakers need to think about the entire system shifting and not just individual parts. Another example of this, the dreaded utility death spiral. This term has been used for years to represent how, as more and more consumers begin to self-generate using solar panels or disconnect from the gas distribution grid because they've electrified with heat pumps, the remaining costs to operate and maintain the existing infrastructure are borne by fewer and fewer consumers. Prices increase to compensate, driving more consumers to switch and leading to a downward spiral that eventually causes the utility to collapse. This death spiral hasn't quite emerged yet for major utilities, but its presence looms on the horizon. How do we plan for that? Thinking about the transition at an individual level isn't nearly robust enough to consider the knock-on effects that could occur. The more individual households or companies that shift their energy usage, it leaves a smaller portion of late adopters in a very unenviable position of holding extra costs. And, for the most part, we can assume that low and moderate income customers are likely a large swath of those late adopters, given their lack of ability to finance technology changes in the first place. Want to know why the IRA and individual state bills have been so focused on disadvantaged customers? It's because of this scenario, something I'll be discussing in a future episode on gas distribution companies. Look, the energy transition was never going to be an easy switch. Not only do we have to build new ecosystems around entirely new industries, but we have to unwind the existing dependent systems that already exist. It's this balancing act that policymakers and regulators need to consider as they address the next phase of climate action. For the most part, we now have the technologies needed for a clean energy economy. The next challenge is in how to properly roll them out so that we're not inadvertently causing knock-on effects that topple the entire Jenga tower right over. I'm Paul Schuster, and this has been your 8 Minutes.